You're watching UATV News. My name is Inna Kosinska. Good evening. Situation in the Donbas and occupied Crimea, temporarily uncontrolled by Ukraine, is a serious challenge for Europe. This was stated by the OSCE chairperson in office, Swedish Foreign Minister Ann Linde, at the opening of the OSCE Foreign Ministers Council, which is taking place in Stockholm. Our colleagues will tell more about the meeting and other events in Sweden.
During the meeting of the OSCE foreign ministers, head of the organization, Ann Linde, expressed concern over the lack of progress in achieving political settlement of the situation in Donbas. She called on the parties to respect all the rights of people who are on opposite sides of the contact line, especially humanitarian.
Humanitarian needs must prevail over political considerations. Crossing points should be open on both sides of the contact line to ensure that civilians have access to their rights wherever they reside in Ukraine. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected.
Before the start of the conference, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba met with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The head of the U.S. Department of State assured his colleague of strong support.
You know, the Ukrainian people know the unwavering commitment of the United States to Ukraine's territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its independence. I think coming from the NATO meetings, that is a view that not only the United States holds, but all of our NATO allies hold as well.
I think it's a great coincidence that we have those NATO and OSCE events following each other, because these are the venues which fit the best to discuss the security situation and the way how allies and other European countries can deter Russia from resorting to a military operation again. As we see, Russia provokes Ukraine militarily, but also diplomatically. We will continue to demonstrate restraint.
On the eve of the meeting of ministers in Stockholm, a separate, parallel conference of the civic solidarity was held. Public figures and human rights defenders discussed the killings, threats and persistent attacks they face in the OSCE member states and suggested ways out.
So we need a re-evaluation and consideration of the human dimension in the light of the current challenges. And our proposal is that we, devise a procedure whereby between now and 2025, the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Agreements,
parallel conference of the civic solidarity was held. Public figures and human rights defenders discussed the killings, threats and persistent attacks they face in the OSCE member states and suggested ways out. The participants of the conference argued that in most countries of the former Soviet Union, which are now members of the OSCE, observers and missions record a huge number of human rights violations, among which there are already new signs. For instance, face recognition system in Russia to identify protesters, even with masks on their faces.
This year we presented issues related to the restriction of peaceful assemblies, examining both the situation in Belarus and the situation in Russia and the complexity of combining epidemiological restrictions. Of course, political prisoners were mentioned as well, because it is a direct harm for Ukraine that the aggressor country conducts politically motivated arrests.
At the same time, other problems faced by human rights defenders were also mentioned at the conference. These include the persecution of groups that protect migrants, persecution of women's organizations and individual representatives of the LGBT movement, and many other issues that relate to the safety of public action in the OSCE member states.
We had the opportunity to look for common ground and jointly develop resolutions and change the focus, including in approaches to the security system. Because in recent years, the concepts of security have been revised. What is security? What does it look like? Since there is such a traditional view of security, what is about military security, state security? We're approaching from the other side from the point of view of human security.
Human rights activists will try to convey all these questions to the distinguished participants of the meeting of the OSCE foreign ministers, which will last until the 3rd of December, reported by Nick Starkov and Alexei Matsuka from Stockholm for UATV News.
President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky stands for negotiations with the Russian Federation in different formats. Venyslavsky, presidential representative in the Constitutional Court, spoke about this on the air of our TV channel. He commented on the statement of Volodymyr Zelensky in the parliament about the need for direct contacts with Russia. According to Venyslavsky, this goes about avoiding mediators imposed by the Kremlin.
The president did not say that he would meet face-to-face only. He spoke about direct negotiations with the Russian Federation. This means that we should all understand that only the Russian Federation, which is a part to the conflict, can by its concrete actions contribute to its termination. According to Kremlin, there is a subject with whom we should negotiate. Those are representatives of the so-called republics in uncontrolled territories. But this is the logic of the Kremlin. Therefore, Zelensky says there can be no other subjects except for another country at war.
The United States of America is ready to impose additional sanctions against Russia if necessary. This was stated by Press Secretary of the White House. Earlier, Washington expressed concern over the growing number of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. Psaki noted that the United States is in contact on this issue with both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, as well as with its international allies.
In terms of what the tools would be, we have demonstrated from the beginning of this administration that we are willing to use a number of tools, economic tools and other tools to address harmful Russian actions. The Secretary made clear today that we would not hesitate for making use of those tools, but we're going to do that in coordination and close coordination with our partners and allies.
Violation of human rights in the occupied Crimea, aggravation of the security situation, development of the Crimean platform. A number of these and other issues were discussed by diplomats in Brussels during the 9th round of informal Ukraine-EU consultations on the legal consequences of the temporary occupation of Crimea by Russia. This was reported by First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dzhaparova. She noted that such negotiations have been held since 2014 and are one of the international platforms for discussing topical issues related to the peninsula. This is one of the key dialogue platforms between Ukraine and the EU. Its purpose is to discuss relevant information with the EU on measures taken in the context of solving a whole range of pressing problems occurred as a result of temporary occupation of Crimea. At the same time, the consultations help to ensure coordination and increase the effectiveness of international efforts to comply with the policy of non-recognition of attempts to illegally occupy the peninsula, as well as help counter the steps of the Russian Federation to undermine the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Dzhaparova, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. The state budget for 2022 is approved. The Parliament of Ukraine passed the main financial document of the country in the second reading. 268 MPs supported it. Between the first and second readings, the government and the relevant committee included an increase in both revenues and expenditures in the draft. The main priorities for state funding are increasing salaries for doctors, providing housing for veterans of hostilities in the Donbas, digitalization and support of the defense sector. This was stated by Minister of Finance of Ukraine, Marchenko.
It was the reinforced investment component that the efforts of the Ministry of Finance and representatives of the government, people's deputies, were concentrated on during finalizing the budget before the second reading. The result was a record growth in capital expenditures. Their share in the composition of the state budget expenditures increased to 9.4%. This is the highest figure over the past 10 years.
COVID indicators have completely stabilized in Kyiv in 5 regions of the state. This is reported by the Ministry of Health. Over the past day, more than 13,500 new cases were registered. 525 people died of complications. Most of the infected are in Kyiv, Zhytomyr and Donetsk regions. The Ministry of Health urged Ukrainians to get vaccinated. This is the only way to protect oneself from illness. This is especially true on the eve of the New Year holidays in order to avoid the tightening of quarantine restrictions.
Як ми і анонсували, все більше існування.
As we announced earlier, more and more quarantine restrictions are felt only by people who have not yet been vaccinated against COVID-19. Therefore, ski resorts are allowed to provide services only to those people whose COVID documents were checked. Adult visitors and clients on winter vacations must have either a document confirming vaccination against COVID-19 or a negative test result or a certificate of recovery.
One will have 4 months to spend 1,000 hryvnias, that is some $40, which the state will pay to fully vaccinated Ukrainians. If during this time the money is not used, it will go back to the state. This was announced by Minister of Culture and Information Policy of Ukraine, Oleksandr Tkachenko. Those who received vaccinations but did not install the DA application will also be able to receive money.
Громадяни зможуть розрахуватися коштами.
Citizens will be able to pay with a virtual bank card in certain companies. The exact list of services is still being formed, but plans include trains and domestic flights, gym tickets, tickets to cinemas, theaters, museums or exhibition centers, and the purchase of books. It will not be possible to withdraw money to another card or use it for other services. The program provides support to only those industries that have suffered from COVID crisis the most.
In January, the third jab against coronavirus will be offered in Ukraine, Minister of Health Viktor Lyashko said. Vaccination with so-called booster dose has been actively rolled out in the USA, Israel, Austria, Italy, Poland, Great Britain and other countries since summer. How important the vaccination process is for herd immunity, my colleagues found out.
The third jab rollout is a scenario that Ukraine will sooner or later come to, experts say. However, until at least half of the population is vaccinated, there is no point in it, as booster dose will now affect the herd immunity. At the same time, according to the recommendations of specialists, it is time for those who were immunized in spring to get a third jab, especially for those who are at high risk.
The third jab is indicated for people with weakened immunity. Such a recommendation already exists. Those are people who get immunosuppressive therapy, who receive the same course of chemotherapy, they had serious depression of immune system, they may have lost a response after 2 doses or not form one at all. For them, the third dose is already recommended.
Antibodies live 6 months on the average of 2 doses of the vaccine, and this period does not depend on the manufacturer of the drug.
One's immunity, unfortunately, is not a long-term thing. Duration of immunity is about 6-8 months after vaccination, and therefore Israel was the first in the world who introduced a booster, because people over 60-65 years who were vaccinated at the end of 2020 started to get sick.
According to Israeli scientists, the third dose increases the amount of antibodies by 10 times. Almost half of the country's population managed to get a booster in Israel. Children over 5 years old are also immunized there.
There is a high level of trust to the Minister of Health here. If the Minister of Health says that everyone needs to stand on their head for 10 minutes, then everyone will stand. No one here argues with the Minister of Health.
In Austria, the third dose was offered at the end of summer. It is recommended primarily for people aged 65 and older, but any Austrian can be revaccinated if one would like to.
This is my will, since there are recommendations. After 4 months after the second jab, you can already get the third. And since I'm going to visit my wonderful homeland Ukraine in December, I decided to get the third jab. 6 months have passed since the second dose, and it was my personal intention.
In Ukraine, most of those who have already been vaccinated twice are ready for the booster dose.
Let's see how effective it will be, looking at the experience of those countries where the third jab is already provided. And if it is really effective, then we will do.
Yes, I'm ready. Well, how else? You can go nowhere without it. So whether you want it or not, you have no choice. We'll see in a year what the situation will be. Now I don't want to think about it at all.
According to experts, it is possible to mix different vaccines given a booster dose, and it is the third dose that will be able to protect against dangerous mutations of the coronavirus, such as Delta, Delta Plus, Alpha and Omicron. Reported by Nick Starkov and Larissa Zubenko, UATV News.
Militant groups launched a gunfire against the migrant camp in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. At least 22 people died in the offense. Wounded soldier of the government army was evacuated by Airborne detachment, namely by Ukrainian peacekeepers. Earlier this year, they have evacuated village residents from the erupting volcano and transferred scientists volcanologists on the way back. Our special correspondent Alexander Machov, who is now in Africa, saw one of such mission flights.
The main duty of the Ukrainian peacekeeping mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is conducting of shipping missions. The country is in fact struggling over the road absence. The terrain is largely roadless here. When there is a road, it's rather impassable for vehicles. That's why the airlift is the only reliable way of transfer. Ukrainian peacekeepers, namely the 18th Separate Helicopter Detachment, is on duty of cargo and human transportations. Apart from these, soldiers perform reconnaissance, flies off aimed at disclosure of the militant hideouts in the jungle. Normally, militants conduct swift ambush against UN mission bases and civilians using jungle as the cover. Today, Ukrainian aviators complete an evacuation mission. A soldier of the Democratic Republic of the Congo sustained gunshot wound during a combat with one of the militant groups. The main task of Ukrainian Airborne here is collecting and delivering information about hideouts to the UN ground forces. In 3 months, Ukrainian peacekeepers performed over 1,000 such flights. Reported by Alexander Makhov, Alexander Khlinin and Nick Starkov, specially from Democratic Republic of Congo for UATV News.
That's all for this hour. More updates on our official website, YouTube, Twitter and Facebook pages. Thank you for staying with UATV channel. Goodbye.